It was one of those sharp autumn mornings when the air feels as though it has been honed on a knife's edge. Lord Peter Wimsey, settling into his breakfast with the Times, found his thoughts abruptly interrupted by a letter slid discreetly under his door by his man Bunter. The envelope bore the faint scent of violets and the bold hand of Miss Harriet Vane. Inside, a single page. Peter. Something exceedingly peculiar at the home of Sir Reginald Fenton. A death. The police are baffled. Would you come at once? H. Peculiar deaths were, to Wimsey, as strong coffee to the ordinary man. They stirred the senses. Within the hour he was in the Daimler, the engine purring along the leaf-strewn road to Fenton Hall, a sprawling Georgian house perched on a rise above the village. The police were already there. Inspector Parker stood in the wide front hall, his face caught between professional composure and the faint frown of a man presented with a puzzle missing half its pieces. "Morning, Parker," said Wimsey, stripping off his gloves. "I gather we have an entertainment of the more perplexing sort." Parker nodded toward the broad oak staircase. Sir Reginald's nephew Arthur, found dead in the study. Single shot to the chest. Study door locked from the inside, windows barred. No firearm in the room. And to make things more diverting, the only key to the desk drawer in front of him was in his own pocket. Yet the drawer was locked and empty. "Empty drawers do not usually occasion such consternation," said Wimsey lightly, though his eyes sharpened. "They do," Parker replied, "when the household swears the drawer contained a sealed envelope with 51,000 bearer bonds yesterday afternoon." Wimsey was shown into the study. It was a tall, rather gloomy room, lined with leather, bound books and smelling faintly of gun oil and old tobacco. Arthur Fenton's body slumped sideways in the high, back chair behind the desk, head lolling, the dark stain spreading across his waistcoat. There was no gun to be seen. The window behind him was bolted. The rug beneath the desk was undisturbed, with no sign of a dropped weapon. Bunter, already at work photographing the scene, murmured, "No powder burns, my lord." Shot from some distance, but no place to shoot from. Wimsey crouched by the desk. The drawer's brass lock gleamed faintly. He gave it a gentle tug. It held firm. Parker handed him the small brass key found in the dead man's trouser pocket. The lock clicked open. Inside nothing but the faint smell of cedar and, oddly, lavender. "Lavender," murmured Wimsey. "Does Sir Reginald's household perfume their paperwork?" Parker shook his head. "The lavender is odd enough. But here's the stranger part. Only 3 people have keys to the study: Sir Reginald, his secretary Miss Marlowe, and the deceased himself. Sir Reginald was at his club all day yesterday. Miss Marlowe says she was in town shopping. No one else admits to being here. And yet," Wimsey mused, "someone was. Someone who could fire a gun without leaving a gun behind and extract bonds from a drawer that, if Miss Marlowe's testimony is to be believed, was never unlocked, except by a man now too dead to tell us." A faint metallic scent caught Wimsey's attention. He sniffed along the edge of the desk until his nose reached the faintest glint of oil around the drawer's hinges. Not the lock, just the hinges. He turned to Parker. "Has anyone examined the back of this desk?" They moved it forward with a grunt. The rear panel, once revealed, showed 2 old screw holes, empty. Wimsey tapped the panel, and it rattled faintly. With Parker's penknife, he pried a section away, revealing a crude sliding compartment running parallel to the drawer's back wall. "Ah," Wimsey said. "An old smuggler's trick. Makes for a fine hiding spot, but also a fine way to empty a drawer without touching the lock." The compartment was empty, but a faint smudge of lavender powder lingered there, the sort ladies used to scent linens. Bunter, examining the scent with exaggerated delicacy, murmured, "This would match Miss Marlowe's handkerchief from this morning, my lord. I noticed it when she dabbed her eyes." Wimsey's brow furrowed. "Interesting. But we still have the matter of a locked room and no weapon." The puzzle of the missing gun proved more obstinate. The floorboards showed no disturbance, no trapdoor. The only way in or out, theoretically, was the door or the barred windows. Parker confirmed both had been under observation since the body was discovered. Then Wimsey noticed the faintest scuff mark along the bottom edge of the tall grandfather clock in the corner. He stepped closer, opened the clock's front panel, and smiled. Nestled behind the swinging pendulum was a small, neat revolver. "Not bad," he murmured. "With the right timing, one could open the clock, drop the weapon in, and shut it again. Hardly visible unless you know to look. But for that, one would have to be here immediately after the shot was fired, perhaps even before." Harriet's voice came from the doorway, calm but edged. "Peter, Miss Marlowe has just remembered she returned to the hall yesterday afternoon after all. Only for a few minutes, of course." Wimsey straightened, his gaze thoughtful. The crime was beginning to take shape in his mind. Though the exact motive and the reason for Arthur Fenton's death, rather than mere theft, remained tangled. But one thing was certain. The locked drawer had never been the real mystery. It was the scent of lavender, the sliding panel, and a grandfather clock that told a far deadlier story than the missing bonds alone. And in that quiet, heavy air of the study, Wimsey knew the solution would hinge not on what was taken, but on what had been left behind. Wimsey's fingers lingered on the revolver's grip for a moment longer before he replaced it in the clock, careful not to disturb the position. The police photographer had finished his work, and Parker was making notes, already preparing to question the household again. "You'll handle the formalities, Parker," Wimsey said lightly. "But I'd like a quiet word with Sir Reginald and Miss Marlowe before your constables go tramping through their recollections with steel-toed boots." Sir Reginald Fenton was in the morning room, staring into the fire with the brittle stillness of a man whose dignity is at war with his shock. He rose when Wimsey entered, his lined face set in severe lines. "Inspector Parker tells me my nephew has been murdered, and my bearer bonds stolen. The one is a tragedy. The other, well, the other is business. Business of a sort that might bankrupt a lesser man," said Wimsey. "When was the last time you saw the bonds?" "Yesterday morning. Arthur came into the study while I was at my desk. I showed him the envelope, God knows why now, and locked it away. That was about 11. I left for my club before lunch and did not return until after dinner." The study was locked as always. Wimsey inclined his head. "And Miss Marlowe?" Sir Reginald hesitated. "She is loyal and efficient. I've trusted her for 12 years. If you're suggesting—" "I'm suggesting nothing," said Wimsey easily. "Merely gathering impressions. Miss Marlowe was found in the small library, ostensibly cataloguing a stack of new books. She was a trim, composed woman in her 30s, with dark hair coiled neatly at her nape, and a manner that could have been mistaken for calm had Wimsey not noticed the faint tremor in her hands as she closed a ledger. "I understand you returned to the hall briefly yesterday," Wimsey said. Her eyes flickered toward the window before she answered. "Yes, I forgot a letter I meant to post. I was in town most of the day and came back around 4. I went straight to my office, found the letter, and left again. I didn't see Arthur." "A pity," Wimsey murmured. "And yet, one might think you'd have passed the study door." Her lips curved faintly, though her voice was steady. "I might have, yes. but I had no reason to enter. It was small, but he caught it. The briefest tightening of her shoulders at the word enter. As though the study itself were a thing to be avoided. And there was the lavender scent again, faint but unmistakable. Leaving her to her books, Whimsy rejoined Parker in the hall. "I'd like to speak with the other residents," he said. Quietly. The butler, a gaunt fellow named Croft, offered little beyond routine. He had been in the pantry when the shot was heard and assumed Arthur was practicing with one of his target pistols. The housemaid Elsie was more interesting. She swore she had been dusting the upper landing when she heard not just a bang, but a sharp thud immediately after. Like something hitten wood, sir. Not the floor, more hollow-like. Hollow, you say? Whimsy's eyes narrowed. And where is your dusting likely to have taken you just before that? The upstairs corridor, sir, just above the study. There's a big old cabinet there, backs onto the same wall. Parker gave Whimsy a look, but said nothing as they went to inspect. The cabinet was heavy oak, built flush against the wall. Whimsy ran his hand along its side, then tapped. The sound changed slightly in one spot, a hollow resonance. A careful push, and a narrow panel shifted open, revealing a small recess leading downwards at an angle, a sort of crude chute terminating behind the grandfather clock downstairs. A convenient postal service for firearms, Whimsy remarked. Drop the revolver here and it lands neatly behind the pendulum. Explains your hollow thud, Elsie. Back in the study, he crouched again, studying the desk's back panel. The sliding compartment was clearly old, but the dust inside bore a single fresh fingerprint in lavender powder. Too delicate to belong to a workman. This was recent, deliberate. Harriet reappeared in the doorway. Peter, I've just had the oddest encounter. One of the gardeners claims he saw Arthur yesterday afternoon in the rose garden, speaking rather heatedly with Miss Marlowe. He says she was holding something small and square, wrapped in brown paper. Small, square, and scented, perhaps. Whimsy murmured. The picture was sharpening the bonds removed through the false back. The gun disposed of via the hidden chute. The presence of lavender as a signature touch. Yet the precise sequence, and why Arthur had to die rather than merely be robbed, remained elusive. He turned to Parker. Routine will serve you well, old man, but it won't find the flaw in this arrangement. We have a woman with a scent that drifts into all the wrong places. A dead man who might have caught her in the act, and a household that insists on remembering events only when pressed. Somewhere in these shifting recollections lies the first true lie, and once we pull at that thread, the rest will unravel. Parker sighed. And you think Miss Marlowe's the thread? Whimsy smiled faintly. She's a thread. But whether she's the one that holds the tapestry together, or merely an embroidered flourish, we shall see soon enough. The scent of lavender seemed to cling to the air as they left the study, a soft but insistent reminder that in Fenton Hall, nothing, least of all the truth, was as neatly locked away as it appeared. The rain had begun to fall in a fine, persistent drizzle by the time Whimsy and Parker gathered the household in the long drawing room for more formal questioning. The great mullioned windows cast a grey light over the assembled faces. Sir Reginald in his high-backed chair. Miss Marlowe with her hands folded too neatly in her lap. Croft the butler standing like a sentinel by the door. Elsie hovering awkwardly near the sideboard. And a thin, sallow-faced man introduced as Mr. Henry Lowther, Sir Reginald's nephew by marriage and, apparently, a frequent visitor. Parker began with the straightforward questions where each person had been between 3 and 5 the previous afternoon. The answers came readily enough, but it was in the edges of their words. the hesitations, the unnecessary details, that Whimsy's attention lingered. Miss Marlowe was first. As I said, I returned briefly for a letter. I arrived just before 4, went straight to my office, and left within 10 minutes. I saw no one except Croft in the hall. Croft's brows rose fractionally. "Begging your pardon, miss, but I didn't see you until you came down the stairs." That would have been nearer 4:30. A delicate pause. "Perhaps you're right. I didn't take note of the exact time." Whimsy's eyes sharpened. The 10-minute visit had just gained an unexplained extra 20 minutes. Sir Reginald was brisk, almost dismissive. "I was at my club all day, as I told you. Luncheon with old friends, a game of billiards, and I returned here at 8:15. That's all? Any witnesses to your billiards victory?" Whimsy asked mildly. "Several. Though I fail to see the relevance. On the contrary, sir, alibis are the embroidery on the plain cloth of fact. One must inspect the stitching." Lowther's turn brought a shift in the atmosphere. He was eager, too eager, to be helpful. "I was in the village most of the afternoon, at the public house. You can ask the landlord. Left about 5 and came straight here. I was the one who found Arthur in the study. Terrible sight. Door was locked, so I had to fetch Croft to break it open. Croft, impassive, corrected him. You called me from the pantry and said there'd been a shot. When we went to the study, you tried the door and found it locked. But it was I who fetched the spare key from Sir Reginald's desk." Lowther flushed faintly. "Yes? Well, the shock of the thing muddles the memory." Elsie spoke last, nervously twisting her apron. "I was dustin' upstairs, sir. Heard the shot and the third I told you about. Didn't see no one in the corridor." She hesitated, glancing at Miss Marlowe, then added, "But I did hear someone comin' up the back stairs not long before. Light steps. Could have been one o' the ladies. Or Mr. Lowther, if he was wearin' soft shoes." Whimsy, watching Miss Marlowe closely, saw the briefest tightening at the corners of her mouth. "The back stairs," he said softly, "lead directly to the upstairs corridor and to the cabinet with the little hollow behind it." No one answered. After dismissing them, Parker muttered, "Lowther's changing details, Miss Marlowe's shaving off or adding minutes, and Sir Reginald doesn't want anyone questioning his club hours. They're all slippery in their own ways." "Quite," said Whimsy. "But notice how quickly Lowther placed himself as the discoverer of the body. He wants to be part of the story. People who insert themselves too neatly often hope to guide the narrative. And Miss Marlowe? She, my dear Parker, is not guiding but concealing. Her lavender powder has been in both the secret drawer and, if Elsie's ears don't deceive her, on the back stairs at just the right time. But her motive is still under wraps, too much restraint, too precise. I should like to know what passed between her and Arthur in the rose garden." They tried separately, questioning each again in private. Lowther stuck to his revised tale, each retelling smoothing away inconsistencies, yet never quite erasing them. Croft swore his loyalty to Sir Reginald and claimed no knowledge beyond what he had already said. Though Whimsy caught the faintest flicker of distaste when Lowther's name arose. Miss Marlowe remained the calmest, even under Parker's deliberate pressure. "Yes, I spoke with Arthur in the garden," she admitted at last. "He was angry. Accused me of prying into his uncle's affairs. I told him to mind his tone. That was the end of it." She met Whimsy's gaze with unflinching eyes, but her hand, resting on the arm of her chair, twitched once. When they emerged into the hall, Harriet was waiting with a folded slip of paper. "Peter, I thought you'd like to see this. I found it in the wastebasket in the library. torn in half, but the handwriting matches Miss Marlowe's. It was a note, brief and precise. 4 o'clock. Study. Drawer Whimsy turned it over in his fingers, his expression unreadable. Now why? He said softly. Would a woman arrange a meeting in a locked study with a man who ends up shot, the bonds missing, and herself professing she barely saw him? Parker blew out a slow breath. Because she's lying. And she's not the only one. No, Whimsy said, slipping the note into his pocket. But the lies are beginning to overlap, Parker. And when lies overlap, they tend to tear. The rain continued its steady patter against the glass, as if marking the slow, deliberate beat of an investigation, drawing closer to the moment when someone's story would finally give way. Whimsy stood at the window of the drawing room, the note from the library turning over and over between his fingers. Outside, the rain blurred the gardens into a haze of grey and muted green. The rose beds little more than ghostly shapes. Behind him, Parker was spreading his notebook on the table, reviewing each statement with the weary precision of a man trying to untangle several knots at once. Let's take them in order, Parker said. Sir Reginald. If the bonds were stolen, he's the one who loses the most. But he's also the one with the most to gain from an insurance claim. And his alibi rests on a handful of club acquaintances who might not remember the exact hour he left. Whimsy murmured. And if he came back earlier than he admits, he could have found Arthur meddling in the study, lost his temper. And, well, he tapped the note against his palm. But that doesn't fit neatly with the lavender or the little sliding panel. Miss Marlowe. Then, Parker continued. She admits to the garden quarrel, she's tied to the lavender, and she had access to both the study and the back stairs. If Arthur caught her taking the bonds, he could have threatened to expose her. And she, fearing dismissal or worse, shoots him, hides the gun, and leaves the room locked. Whimsy's voice was thoughtful. Possible. But if she was planning theft, why summon him to the study at all? That note feels like bait. Parker nodded grimly. Lo, there's another story. His eagerness to be seen as the discoverer of the body could be vanity, or it could be a way to control the scene. If he knew about the chute from the cabinet to the clock, he might have used it. And he has no obvious motive for killing Arthur, Whimsy pointed out, unless, he trailed off, eyes narrowing, unless Arthur had something on him. Some family matter, perhaps. People will do extraordinary things to keep an old scandal buried. Parker looked unconvinced. And the maid Elsie? She's the least likely. But she's the only one who claims to have heard both the shot and the thud. That's either the truth, or a detail added to seem useful. Whimsy turned from the window, his manner sharpening. You see the problem, Parker. Each of them has a plausible motive for part of the puzzle, but no one has a motive that explains the whole. Sir Reginald might gain financially. But why involve the lavender or the back stairs? Miss Marlowe could want the bonds, but why kill Arthur in a way that risks discovery? Lowther could control the narrative, but to what end? This is not a single thread, but a whole tangle. He began pacing, his mind moving faster than his words. Greed for the bonds, yes, but also fear of exposure. And revenge, perhaps. Arthur was not well liked. That much is clear. The quarrel in the garden suggests personal animosity, the locked drawer suggests calculated theft, the missing gun suggests premeditation. But when you weave them together, the tapestry bulges in all the wrong places. Harriet entered quietly, holding a thin leather folder. I found this in the small safe in Sir Reginald's study. He didn't object, said it was just old correspondence. But I think you'll find the last letter interesting. Whimsy took it and scanned the page. It was from a solicitor, dated 6 months earlier, discussing a change to Sir Reginald's will. The change left a substantial sum to Arthur, money that would otherwise go to Lowther. Whimsy said softly. So Lowther loses heavily if Arthur lives long enough to inherit. That gives him a reason for murder, if not for theft. And if Lowther killed Arthur for the inheritance, Parker mused, someone else could have taken the bonds during the confusion. 2 crimes in one afternoon. Whimsy's eyes gleamed. Now that is interesting. Imagine, Lowther kills for revenge or inheritance, while another uses the opportunity to commit theft. That would explain the overlapping lies. But then, was the theft planned? Or was it opportunistic? That depends on whether Miss Marlowe's note was meant for Arthur or for someone else. Harriet said, if it was for Arthur, it could be about the quarrel. If for another, it might have been a signal. Whimsy smiled faintly. Signals, lavender. Secret drawers. It's beginning to look like a 3-handed game, with each player thinking they're the only one at the table. And Arthur, poor, unlikable Arthur, ended up holding the wrong cards. They spent the next hour going through each person's movements again, marking the moments when their stories overlapped. Patterns began to emerge. Miss Marlowe's unexplained 20 minutes matched the period when Lowther could not be accounted for. Sir Reginald's club alibi grew suspiciously thin just before 4 o'clock. Elsie's back stairs footsteps could match either of the other 2. By the time the rain had deepened into a steady downpour, Whimsy leaned back in his chair, the corners of his mouth curling in satisfaction. It's all there, Parker. They've been tripping over each other without even realizing it. One came for theft, another for murder, and the third, well, the third may have known far more than they dared admit. But I still need the last piece. Who had the bonds after they left the drawer? Parker looked at him sharply. And how do you plan to find that out? Oh, I shall ask them, Whimsy said lightly, but not in words. Sometimes the truth comes out far quicker when people are made to think they've already been caught. The web of greed, fear, and revenge was almost complete in his mind, but he knew one thing with certainty. The moment he tugged at the right strand, the entire tangle would collapse, leaving one guilty face staring back at him from the wreckage. It was just after luncheon when Parker came striding into the study, rain still clinging to his coat and a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. "We've got it, Peter," he said, dropping a small paper packet onto the desk. Found in Lowther's room, tucked in the lining of his travelling case. 2 of Sir Reginald's missing bearer bonds. Numbers matching the register exactly. Whimsy leaned back in the armchair, fingers steepled, his gaze fixed not on the bonds, but on Parker's face. Indeed. And were they neatly wrapped and labelled, perhaps with a little card saying, "Property of Sir Reginald Fenton"? Very nearly. Wrapped in brown paper, bound with twine. Croft swears he saw the packet yesterday morning on Sir Reginald's desk. Lowther's got no explanation for it, except some nonsense about finding it under a chair in the hall and meaning to return it. Whimsy's mouth curved faintly. The classic tactic. I was just holding it for you. Did Lowther, by chance, look relieved when you confronted him? Relieved. Parker frowned. No, he was furious. Called us every name under the sun. Said we were railroading him. And Sir Reginald, positively delighted. Said it proves Lowther's been scheming for months. Parker's voice hardened. Look, Peter, between the motive from the will, the bonds in his possession, and his shaky alibi, I think we've got enough to hold him. The chief's already preparing the paperwork. Whimsy rose and walked to the window, watching the rain blur the drive into a silver, grey veil. Enough to hold him, perhaps, but enough to convict, and, more importantly, enough to explain the lavender, the note, and the little sliding compartment. No. Parker, I fear you are celebrating far too soon. Parker's jaw tightened. You think someone planted the bonds. I think, Whimsy said slowly, that someone wanted the investigation to end here. Lowther's an excellent scapegoat. Plenty of temper, a decent motive, and just enough foolishness to make him look guilty. But those bonds too convenient. They've appeared at precisely the right moment, in precisely the right place, and in precisely the right quantity to convince you the case is solved. Parker hesitated. So you'd let him go? Certainly not. Let him stew a while. Someone will be watching to see if we truly believe we've caught our man, and when they see us relax, they'll feel safe enough to move. The sense of false victory was palpable that evening. The household, long tense and whispering, seemed to ease. Sir Reginald dined with more appetite than he'd shown since Arthur's death. Miss Marlowe was almost chatty, remarking on the relief of the whole business being practically settled. Even Elsie moved more briskly, though her eyes darted toward Whimsy whenever she passed him. It was Harriet who voiced what he had been thinking as they lingered over coffee in the small parlor. They're all breathing too easily, Peter. Whoever's guilty is enjoying the reprieve. Just so, Whimsy murmured. But the trouble with a reprieve is that it makes people greedy. They start to think about what they haven't yet secured. Late that night, unable to sleep, Whimsy took to the corridors. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and damp. His steps were silent on the thick carpets as he passed the study, the library, and finally the back stairs. There he paused, listening. A faint sound reached him, wood sliding against wood. He moved noiselessly down to the study and pressed himself against the wall beside the door. Inside, there was the unmistakable click of a drawer closing, followed by the rustle of paper. He eased the door open a fraction. A shadowy figure stood at the desk, their back to him, one hand reaching into the open sliding compartment at the rear of the drawer. The scent of lavender drifted toward him. Whimsy stepped fully into the room. A little late for filing, isn't it, Miss Marlowe? She spun, eyes wide. A packet of bonds clutched in her hand. For an instant, something like calculation flickered across her face before she slipped into her usual composure. Lord Peter, how alarming. You startled me. I couldn't sleep, and I thought I might check if any other papers were missing. In the middle of the night, Whimsy's voice was silky. From a locked compartment you have no reason to know about. Her lips parted, but before she could answer, Parker burst in from the hall, drawn by the voices. His eyes fell on the packet in her hand, and his face hardened. That's it, then. Lowther's not our thief, you are. Whimsy held up a hand. Not so fast, Parker. You've caught her in possession? Yes, but I rather think she's not our murderer. This, he gestured to the bonds, is an attempt to finish what was interrupted. And I suspect the interruption came in the form of a bullet to poor Arthur. Miss Marlowe's expression did not change, but her fingers tightened around the packet. You can think what you like, Lord Peter, but you have no proof I killed him. No, Whimsy said softly, but I have proof you didn't. Which means our killer is still watching, and still waiting for their moment to strike again. Parker looked from one to the other, frustration warring with reluctant understanding. The early triumph had crumbled, leaving the real quarry still hidden in the shadows. And somewhere in Fenton Hall, that quarry knew the game was not yet over. Miss Marlowe was taken upstairs under Parker's watch, her expression unreadable, the lavender clinging faintly in her wake. Whimsy remained in the study, leaning one hip against the desk, fingers tracing the groove worn into the edge by years of use. The room was still, yet something in its stillness pressed at him. Not the weight of the present crime, but the whisper of something older, half buried beneath dust and habit. He let his eyes wander, not to the obvious drawer, clock, carpet, but to the framed photographs on the far wall. There, between a stiff formal portrait of Sir Reginald in his youth and an old hunt scene, hung a smaller photograph, yellowing at the edges. It showed 3 young men in uniform, standing shoulder to shoulder outside a nondescript barracks. Arthur was not among them. The faces were younger but unmistakable: Sir Reginald, Henry Lowther, and Croft the butler. Whimsy crossed the room for a closer look. The date scrawled on the mount read 1919. His mouth curved in a slow, considering smile. Well, Croft," he murmured. "You've been in the family longer than advertised." The door creaked behind him. Harriet slipped in, closing it softly. "I thought you'd still be here." "There's something you should see. Came across it while I was going through Sir Reginald's correspondence in the library." She handed him a thin envelope, the paper brittle with age. Inside was a typewritten note, unsigned, dated nearly 20 years ago. "If the truth about Antwerp comes out, we'll all hang. Keep it quiet, no one else need Antwerp." Whimsy's brow furrowed. Apparently, during the last months of the war, Sir Reginald, Lowther, and Croft were stationed there together. And according to an old local paper I found, there was an incident, black market dealings, a warehouse fire, and the disappearance of a shipment of government bonds. "Bonds again," Whimsy murmured. He turned back to the photograph. So the 3 of them shared a very particular past, and one they were willing to keep buried. I wonder, did Arthur know? And if so, did he threaten to bring it to light? Parker returned just in time to catch that last sentence. If Arthur had leverage over them, that gives all 3 a motive to shut him up. But why steal the current bonds? The old Antwerp business can't be tied to these. "Can't it?" Whimsy said softly. "Suppose the missing Antwerp bonds were never destroyed or sold. Suppose they've been hidden all these years, converted, perhaps, or held under false names. And suppose Sir Reginald needed cash quickly, but couldn't touch the Antwerp money without risking exposure. The bearer bonds in the drawer were a neat solution. But Arthur, either by accident or design, found the link between the old crime and the present." Harriet nodded slowly. "That would explain his quarrel with Miss Marlowe, if she stumbled across some of the old documents, and it would explain why the theft and the murder might be 2 separate acts. One to silence Arthur, the other to grab the bonds before the police sealed everything." Parker looked grim. "So which of them pulled the trigger?" "That," said Whimsy, "is the last question standing. But the answer lies in the past as much as in the present. Whoever fired that shot had the most to lose if Arthur opened his mouth about Antwerp. And they had to be here, in this house, yesterday afternoon." The next morning, Whimsy sent Bunter to the village to telegraph a friend in the War Office. By afternoon, the reply came. Sir Reginald and Lowther had been suspected but never charged in the Antwerp affair. Croft, however, had been briefly detained and released for lack of evidence, rumored to be the one who actually handled the missing bonds. Whimsy folded the message slowly. "Parker, our quiet butler may be the most dangerous man in this house." That evening, under the pretense of needing brandy from the cellars, Whimsy intercepted Croft alone. "Funny thing about old photographs," he he said conversationally as they descended the narrow stairs. "They bring back such memories. Antwerp, for instance." Croft froze mid-step. The pause was so brief it might have been nothing. But whimsy saw the flicker in his eyes. "I don't know what you mean, my lord." "Oh, I think you do," whimsy replied lightly. "Arthur certainly did. And he might still be alive if he'd been less fond of historical research." The butler's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. When they reached the cellar, he busied himself with the bottles, his movements sharp, deliberate. Whimsy watched in silence until Croft straightened, the brandy in hand. "I served this family faithfully for 30 years, Croft said quietly. "I've kept their secrets." "All of them," Whimsy smiled without warmth. "Even the ones worth killing for?" The brandy bottle trembled fractionally before Croft set it down. "You've no proof, my lord. And without proof, the past stays where it belongs." But Whimsy, following him back up the stairs, knew better. The shadows of Antwerp had crept into Fenton Hall. And until he pulled the truth into daylight, the murderer still walked freely under its roof. That night, where long after the house had settled into the uneasy quiet of whispered doors and cautious footsteps, Whimsy sat alone in the study with a chessboard in front of him. The pieces weren't arranged for a game. Rather, they stood as markers, each representing a figure in the case: Sir Reginald the king, Miss Marlowe the queen, Croft as the rook, Lowther the knight, and Arthur, toppled and lying just off the board. Harriet, entering with 2 cups of coffee, raised an eyebrow. "You've taken up abstract sculpture." "Something like it," Whimsy murmured. "I'm testing reactions. A harmless bit of theatre. The trouble is, people in this house are rehearsed. They've worn their lies like tailored suits. Well, fitted and uncreased. But when you offer a move they don't expect, a scene gives way." She set down the coffee. "What's the move?" "A little experiment in misdirection. I'm going to suggest that we've found a witness, a living soul from Antwerp who's prepared to testify. Of course, no such person exists. But I want to see whose pulse quickens." The following morning, Whimsy arranged for Parker to deliver the announcement casually during breakfast. Parker strolled in with a sheaf of papers, murmured something about an old acquaintance of Arthur's from his military research days, who had reached out, and dropped a hint that this man had been in Antwerp during the war. The effect was subtle but distinct. Sir Reginald's spoon paused mid-air, a thin ribbon of tea dripping onto the tablecloth. Miss Marlowe's eyes darted, not to Parker but to Croft. And Croft, the very picture of a butler's impassivity, tightened his grip on the coffee pot so slightly that a bead of dark liquid rolled down its silver neck. Whimsy caught every flicker. "Fascinating," he murmured over his toast. The day passed with the usual movements of a household under strain. But Whimsy had no intention of letting the tension dissipate. That afternoon he requested that each of them join him, one by one, in the study under the pretext of signing statements for the police. It wasn't the papers he cared about, it was the atmosphere he intended to create. When Croft entered, Whimsy was leaning against the mantelpiece, shuffling through what appeared to be a telegram. "Curious thing," he said without looking up. "Our friend from Antwerp claims he remembers a certain warehouse fire. Says he saw 3 men leaving together. One was an officer, one a civilian contractor, and one a man in service livery. Quite a combination, wouldn't you say?" Croft's face remained neutral, but Whimsy noticed the slight flare of his nostrils. "I couldn't say, my lord. War was full of odd pairings." "Indeed it was," Whimsy said lightly. "But here's the rub. He insists the man in livery was carrying a small tin case." the sort used for holding bearer bonds. Croft's eyes flickered, just once, toward the desk drawer where the stolen bonds had been kept. That's an oddly specific recollection. Memory is a treacherous thing, Whimsy replied, watching him closely. Sometimes it improves with the right incentive. By the time Croft left, his usual composure had a hairline fracture. Whimsy repeated similar conversations with Miss Marlowe and Sir Reginald, but neither betrayed the same defensive tautness. That evening, Whimsy took Harriet aside. Croft's reaction wasn't fear of the police. It was fear of a ghost. He knows the Antwerp witness doesn't exist, but he can't be sure how much Arthur might have already uncovered or passed on. And that ghost might just be enough to push him to act. Harriet said, "Precisely. If Croft believes someone still has proof, he may try to find it, or destroy it. And in doing so, he may tell us more than he intends." Whimsy instructed Bunter to place an empty dispatch case, the sort used for sensitive documents, in the library safe, leaving the safe door ever so slightly ajar. A folded sheet of blank paper protruded from the case, just enough to suggest significance. The bait was set. Close to midnight, when the household should have been asleep, Whimsy and Parker waited in the darkened corridor outside the library. The faintest creak of floorboards came from within, followed by the careful click of the safe door. When Parker stepped in with his torch, the beam fell on Croft, one hand in the dispatch case, the other frozen mid-motion. His face was unreadable, but his voice was calm. "I thought I heard a noise, my lord. Came to check nothing had been disturbed." Whimsy stepped forward, his tone almost friendly. "Yes, Croft. I believe you did hear a noise. Only, the noise wasn't in the library, it was in your head. The sound of an old secret rattling its chains." Croft said nothing. He placed the paper back in the case and straightened. Whimsy didn't press him then. He'd learned long ago that an unconventional clue was only half the hunt. The other half was letting the suspect's own mind do the work. And by the look in Croft's eyes, that work had already begun. By the following morning, Whimsy was certain the balance in the house had shifted. Croft was quieter than ever, his movements clipped and economical, as though conserving energy for something yet to come. Sir Reginald's temper frayed over the smallest inconveniences, while Miss Marlowe seemed to have adopted an almost theatrical calm, as if daring someone to suspect her. Harriet, watching the breakfast table with a novelist's eye, murmured to Whimsy, "Something's going to give." It did, sooner than expected. Shortly after midday, Parker came striding into the study, his usually steady voice tight with irritation. "The dispatch case, gone." Whimsy straightened in his chair. "Gone? As in vanished entirely?" "Not just gone," Parker said grimly. "The safe's been opened again, this time properly. Whoever it was took the case and—" he hesitated, then added, "and the fingerprint cards from the evidence box. Everything we pulled from the study the night of the murder." That last detail was a blow. Those cards had held the faint but distinct print they'd found on the edge of Arthur's desk drawer. A smudge that didn't match anyone in the household's voluntary samples. Without them, that line of proof was vapor. For a long moment, Whimsy said nothing. Then, with deliberate calm, he replied, "This isn't a random act. Someone is pruning the tree before we can reach the roots." They questioned the household, of course. Sir Reginald blustered about gross incompetence, and insisted no one under his roof could stoop to theft. Miss Marlowe professed astonishment, but made the curious remark that evidence has a way of changing hands in these matters. Croft was politely indignant, offering to submit to a search of his quarters. Though Whimsy noted He did so with the ease of a man who knew nothing incriminating would be found there. By late afternoon, the search had yielded nothing. The dispatch case, the paper, the fingerprint cards, they had all disappeared as though swallowed whole. Whoever took them? Harriet said as she and Whimsy walked the garden paths, must have known exactly what to remove. That means knowledge of the investigation, not just the household's gossip. Precisely, Whimsy replied. When that narrows our list. But it also tells us our adversary is thinking ahead. They're not merely concealing guilt. They're reshaping the story entirely. If we can't place that print, the case becomes a matter of words against words. And words are far easier to bend. Parker found them just before dinner with another grim discovery. The police storeroom in town had been broken into the night before. Nothing else was missing. No cash, no valuables. Just 2 files, both relating to cases Arthur had handled in his work for the government. One of them was the wartime Antwerp file. Whimsy's expression darkened. So it's not only the present they're erasing, Harriet, it's the past as well. Someone is cutting the thread that connects the two. That night, when the mood in the house was taut brittle, Whimsy kept to the study, ostensibly reading but in truth listening, to footsteps in the hall, to doors opening and closing, to the faint creak of stairs. Trust, he knew, had now become a currency in short supply. If the thief was willing to risk removing evidence from under the police's nose, there was no telling what they might attempt next. Around midnight, a faint rustle at the window caught his attention. He crossed the room silently and pulled back the curtain just in time to catch the shadow of a figure slipping along the side path toward the stables. He didn't follow, yet. Instead, he committed the gait, the height, the shape of the movement, to memory. Let them think the slate is clean, he murmured to himself. But every erasure leaves a trace, and some traces are louder than proof. By morning, he had a plan. One that would not only restore the missing link, but flush the hand that had taken it into the open. The question was whether the rest of the players in this dangerous little drama would still be standing when the truth finally stepped into the light. The plan never reached its first test. Before dawn broke, the household was roused by a cry, sharp, panicked, and cut off too soon. Whimsy was already half-dressed, boots in hand, when Parker hammered at his door. "Come quickly. It's Croft." The valet lay sprawled at the foot of the service staircase, his head twisted at an unnatural angle. A silver candlestick, one from the dining room set, was clenched loosely in his right hand. The smell of spilt wax hung in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of fresh blood. Harriet, pale but steady, stood in the corridor, her eyes fixed on the scene below. "It looks like he fell," she said, though the flatness in her voice betrayed doubt. "Fell," Whimsy echoed, kneeling beside the body. The position of the limbs, the faint smear of wax on the banister, the absence of any candle nearby. None of it was consistent with an accident. "No," he murmured, more to himself than the others. This was arranged. The police arrived swiftly, their manner brisk and grim. Sir Reginald demanded to know what Croft had been doing about at such an hour. Miss Marlowe claimed she had heard footsteps and a sort of scuffle, though her version shifted each time she repeated it. To Parker's quiet observation that Croft might have been the one to remove the dispatch case, Whimsy offered only a slow nod. "If he did," he said, "someone has made certain he will never be questioned about it." By mid-morning, the investigation had twisted sharply on its axis. The missing evidence was no longer the only urgency. Now there was a fresh death, and perhaps a killer who had struck twice within days. Whimsy paced the study, Harriet following him with the keen gaze of one assembling a plot. "Do you think Croft was silenced because he knew too much?" she asked. "Perhaps," Wimsey replied. "Or because he had begun to suspect the wrong person, which, in this case, may be dangerously close to the right one. Either way, the message is the same. Our adversary is still moving pieces while we are looking for the board." A constable brought word that Croft's quarters had been searched. Nothing connected to the stolen items was found, but there was one oddity: an envelope addressed to him in an unfamiliar hand, tucked beneath a loose floorboard. Inside was a single playing card, the King of Spades, its surface marred by a faint smear of something dark, like dried ink or perhaps blood. Parker frowned. "Some kind of threat? Or a signature?" Wimsey said softly. "A little flourish to let us know that this is no crude bludgeoning, but a move in a game. And one in which we are not yet the lead player." That night, the atmosphere in the house turned febrile. Every creak of the old timbers drew glances, every shadow seemed to hold breath. Wimsey made no move to retire early. He knew too well that another strike might come before the night was out. Not at random, but precisely where it would inflict the greatest confusion. Shortly before 2 in the morning, he heard it again. The faint rustle beyond the study window. This time, he moved quickly, slipping into the hallway and catching sight of a figure retreating down the side path. But before he could give chase, a shout rose from upstairs, raw and terrified. It came from Sir Reginald's room. By the time Wimsey and Parker reached it, the door was open, the window flung wide, and Sir Reginald himself stood trembling in his dressing gown, pointing at the sill. "Someone was here, inside the room," he stammered. "I woke to see them. Black gloves, a scarf over the face. They had a knife, I swear it. And then they were gone. Out the window before I could shout again." The constables searched the grounds but found no one. Still, the message was clear. Whoever was orchestrating these moves had no fear of proximity, no hesitation in reaching into the very heart of the house. When the search party returned empty-handed, Wimsey glanced toward Harriet. "We are no longer simply chasing a killer," he said quietly. "We are trying to stay alive long enough to corner one." And somewhere out in the darkness, the game's unseen player was already preparing the next move. The house had not truly slept since the attempt on Sir Reginald. Even the heavy velvet curtains in the drawing room seemed tense, their folds hanging in unnatural stillness. Wimsey, seated at the far end of the long table, let the conversation drift around him without truly hearing it. Miss Marlowe was retelling, for the 4th time, her account of Croft's final hours, embellishing it with fresh detail each time. Sir Reginald still clutched at the lapels of his dressing gown as if to steady himself. Harriet's pen scratched steadily across her notebook, recording, filtering, discarding. It was an offhand phrase that stopped Wimsey's fingers mid-tap. "And of course, Croft never used that staircase. Said it was unlucky, ever since Mrs. Danvers fell down it in 34. Always took the longer way round." Miss Marlowe's words were tossed out like a bit of gossip to fill a lull, but they lodged in Wimsey's mind. Croft's body had been found at the bottom of that very staircase. If he had avoided it for over a decade, what could have compelled him to use it that night? Or, more pointedly, why had his body been placed there? He asked her to repeat herself, and when she did, Harriet caught the flicker in his eyes. "You think he was moved," she said quietly. "Or guided there, perhaps unconscious," Wimsey murmured. "But there's more. Danvers' fall, was it ever considered accidental?" Sir Reginald frowned. "Good Lord, man, that was years ago. She tripped carrying a tray, I believe." But Parker, always the archivist, left the room and returned with an old coroner's note from the estate files. The phrasing was curious. Cause of death, fall from height, but with indications of a blow to the back of the head preceding the descent. No follow-up had been recorded. 2 deaths on the same staircase years apart, both with signs of prior injury. Too neat for coincidence. Wimsey's mind turned over the problem, weighing it against the other threads. The stolen case, the King of Spades, the midnight visitor to Sir Reginald's room. Later, while the household busied itself with guarded chatter, Wimsey wandered the east wing. His steps deliberate, his eyes not on the grand portraits or the dusted gilt frames, but on the door frames and thresholds. Near the servants' passage he paused, bending to examine a faint mark at ankle height. A thin scratch in the paint, too precise to be accidental. Further along, a matching mark on the opposite wall. The width between them was narrow, the kind of gap that might cradle a thin cord stretched taut. A trap. Primitive, but deadly in dim light. Croft could have stumbled over it. Unless he had already been unconscious, in which case it was mere staging. Back in the study, he spread out a rough sketch of the house and began marking incidents: the theft, the first murder, the disappearance of evidence. The attempted intrusion into Sir Reginald's chamber. When plotted against the physical layout, they formed an irregular curve through the building, like beads on a string, leading steadily toward the east wing staircase. Whoever is behind this, Wimsey said, tapping the pattern, is not only choosing victims, but guiding our attention along a deliberate path. This is choreography, Harriet, not chaos. But to what end? She asked. To ensure that when the final act comes, we are all precisely where we are meant to be. Parker entered then, a folded paper in hand. Lou found this under Croft's mattress. Missed it the first search. Looks like a torn page from a ledger. Columns of numbers, dates and initials. Wimsey scanned it. The dates stretched back decades, overlapping with Mrs. Danvers' death, with old staff hirings and quiet dismissals. The initials were those of household members past and present. Beside some of them, a small hand-drawn spade. The King of Spades was not a signature, it was a tally. This is no recent vendetta, Wimsey said, voice low. Our culprit has been marking their work for years. Each spade is a death or a removal. Croft must have found this and realized what it meant. That sealed his fate. Harriet glanced toward the darkening windows. If they've been playing this long, they'll anticipate our moves before we make them. Yes, Wimsey said, folding the paper and slipping it into his pocket. Which is why, if we want the upper hand, we must let them think the pattern is working until it doesn't. He did not add the thought that pressed most insistently in his mind. That somewhere in the next move, the spade might already be drawn with his own initials beside it. It was well past midnight when Wimsey found himself alone in the library. The fire reduced to a dim glow that threw long, wavering shadows against the bookshelves. The ledger fragment lay unfolded before him, the small spade marks seeming almost to glimmer in the flickering light. He had been staring at it for so long that the shapes seemed to shift. But the pattern remained unmistakable. Decades of careful selection, each name removed from the household like pieces cleared from a chessboard. Harriet slipped in quietly, setting down 2 cups of coffee. "You've been tracing those dates for hours," she murmured. "What is it you see that I don't?" "Connections that were never meant to be obvious," he replied, rubbing his temple. "The initials, Harriet, some of them match not just staff, but their relatives. And in every case, those relatives worked for the family before their removal." She leaned over the paper, frowning. You're saying this is about lineage. But why target them? That's what I've been asking, Whimsy said. Until I realized this is not about eliminating enemies, it's about erasing a bloodline. Her pen paused mid-note. Bloodline. He nodded slowly. It started with Mrs. Danvers. Her death, accidental, was the first spade in the ledger. She had a son. He left service shortly after and disappeared entirely. Croft's grandmother was a parlourmaid here, and if you go back far enough, you find every victim shares one common thread. They are all descended from those who once worked in this house during a scandal nearly forgotten. Parker, who had been silently leaning in the doorway, stepped forward. I looked into the old archives in the county hall. In 1898, Sir Reginald's grandfather was embroiled in a hushed-up affair, an illegitimate child with a kitchen maid. The scandal was buried, the girl dismissed. But the child lived, and from that child's line sprang every name in this ledger. Whimsy finished grimly. Harriet's voice was low. So this isn't just revenge, it's a purge. Yes. Someone believes they are cleansing the family line, removing what they see as a stain on the house. And they have been at it for decades. The fire popped sharply, sending a spark into the grate, and the three of them glanced toward the door, half expecting to see the culprit standing there. But that kind of obsession, Harriet said, it's not about the victims, it's about the killer. They've tied their whole identity to this, to protecting the purity of the family name. And in doing so, Whimsy murmured, they've become the very thing they claim to despise. A shadow clinging to the house's past. The irony would be amusing if it weren't so bloody. Parker laid a folded document on the table. Found this locked in the butler's desk. It's a letter, dated 2 years ago, warning Sir Reginald that the old shame is not yet gone, signed with nothing but the spade symbol. Which means, Whimsy said, tapping the page, Sir Reginald knows more than he's admitted. He's known for some time that someone was hunting the descendants. And if he knows, then he also knows who benefits from keeping this bloodline erased. Harriet's brow furrowed. Benefits. Consider the will, Whimsy said. If there are no surviving descendants of the illegitimate branch, then all remaining assets, and the title, pass without contest to the direct heirs. No quiet claims, no awkward inquiries, a perfectly unbroken line. So, Parker said slowly, we're not just talking about an old obsession. We're talking about securing inheritance. Whimsy gave a grim nod. An obsession dressed in the clothes of necessity. And that combination is dangerous. The killer doesn't just believe they're right. They believe they must finish the work. A floorboard creaked somewhere in the hall. The three of them froze listening. But after a long silence, Whimsy exhaled and pushed back from the table. We'll have to draw them out. They're too careful to leave themselves exposed otherwise. But now that we know the motive, we can predict their next move. Harriet met his gaze. Because there's only one descendant left. Yes, he said. But I doubt they've realized it's Harriet Vane. The rain had started again by the time Whimsy crossed the courtyard, Harriet close at his side. The air was sharp with the scent of wet stone and wood smoke, but beneath it there was something else. Anticipation, stretched taut as a wire. Every light in the drawing room was burning, the fire built high. The table set for a late supper, as though the house were merely indulging in hospitality instead of preparing for an execution. Sir Reginald sat stiffly in his armchair, the silver of his hair catching the firelight, his gaze flicking from Harriet to Whimsy with a brittle formality. The others had been gathered Croft, pale but composed, Mrs. Winthrop, her hands folded tightly, and Parker, leaning casually by the mantel as though he were only there to keep warm. Wimsey poured himself a drink, letting the moment stretch. "We have a small matter to resolve before the evening's done," he said, lightly. "A series of murders. You all know the tally, quiet, discreet deaths, stretched across decades. Each victim connected by a single thread descent from a certain, unfortunate liaison in 1898. There was a slight twitch in Mrs. Winthrop's jaw, quickly smoothed over. Wimsey saw it and continued, his voice silk over steel. Of course, such a pattern could be coincidence. Or it could be the work of someone determined to erase that bloodline forever. A long game, planned, methodical, patient. Croft's eyes narrowed. "And you think one of us?" "Oh, I don't think," Wimsey interrupted smoothly. "I know. The trouble with such meticulous work is that it leaves a signature. That little spade symbol in the ledger, present in every note, every warning. And I found the original seal in the drawer of the late butler's desk. Only one person could have had access to it over the last 30 years. Mrs. Winthrop shifted in her seat. "This is ridiculous. I've been in service here all my life." "Yes," Wimsey said softly. "In service to the family name. You watched the scandal play out in whispers, saw the stain, passed down the generations. You made it your mission to erase it, quietly, thoroughly, until nothing remained but the pure line." Her eyes hardened, a flicker of defiance breaking through her composure. "If I did, it was only to protect what should never have been tainted. The house, the title, these things matter. They matter to you," Wimsey corrected. "Not to the dead. And certainly not to Harriet Vane, the last living descendant, who, by your reckoning, should have been dead before she ever set foot in this house." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the patter of rain against the windows. Harriet sat very still, her expression unreadable, but her hand brushed the arm of her chair, as though weighing the distance between herself and Mrs. Winthrop. Parker, meanwhile, had quietly moved from the mantel to block the door. "I suppose you think you've caught me," Mrs. Winthrop said, her voice low, almost conversational. "But you can't prove what's already buried." "Oh, I can," Wimsey said mildly. "You see? I took the liberty of marking a certain envelope with harmless luminescent powder, the sort that glows under ultraviolet light, and when you attempted to remove the last piece of evidence from Sir Reginald's study this afternoon, you marked yourself. A simple inspection will reveal it. Parker." The sergeant clicked on a small handheld lamp, and the soft violet glow lit the room. Across Mrs. Winthrop's fingers and the hem of her sleeve bloomed the unmistakable dusting of pale green light. For a moment, she stared at it, breathing shallowly. Then her expression shifted. No panic, no shame, only the brittle pride of someone who had already accepted the end. "You'll never understand," she said. "It wasn't about me. It was about the house. About making it whole again. And in the process," Wimsey said quietly, "you've made it emptier than it has ever been." She rose suddenly, and for a heartbeat Wimsey thought she meant to lunge for Harriet. But Parker was already there, firm hands on her arms, turning her toward the door. She did not resist, only kept her gaze fixed on the fire as she was led out. The room was very quiet once she was gone. The rain had slowed, the fire crackled, and Harriet let out a slow breath. "I suppose that's it?" "Then, for her, yes," Wimsey said. "For the rest of us, well, the past has a way of leaving shadows." And in the silence that followed, the house seemed to exhale with them. The heavy front door had barely closed behind Mrs. Winthrop when Sir Reginald sank back into his chair, the deep creases on his brow easing for the first time in days. Parker muttered something about paperwork and stepped out to escort her to the constable's wagon, leaving Whimsy and Harriet alone with the crackle of the fire. Harriet tilted her head, studying Whimsy. "You don't look entirely satisfied." Whimsy swirled the remains of his drink, watching the amber liquid catch the firelight. "It's a curious thing," he murmured. "A puzzle completed can still feel incomplete." Before she could reply, the faintest sound, a creak in the hallway, drew both their gazes. Whimsy set his glass down and crossed the room in 3 silent strides, throwing the door open. A figure was there, half-shadowed, retreating toward the stair. "Sir Reginald," Whimsy called softly, and the old man froze. When he turned, his face was pale, eyes bright and wary. "I thought I'd retire for the night." Whimsy stepped into the hall, closing the distance. "You've been very quiet these past hours, Sir Reginald. Almost too quiet for a man who has just seen the person responsible for years of quiet killings taken away." Reginald's mouth twitched. "And what are you implying?" "That Mrs. Winthrop was not alone." A flicker, almost imperceptible, passed over Reginald's expression. Harriet, leaning in the doorway, caught it too. "You see," Whimsy went on, "she was precise, thorough, but her resources were limited. Someone paid for her travel, her quiet lodgings in London during certain disappearances. And there's the matter of the ledger itself. Entries in 2 distinct hands. Hers and yours." Reginald's voice was suddenly brittle. "If I had a hand in it, it was only to keep the house from further disgrace." "Precisely the same justification she gave," Whimsy cut in. "But there's a difference. She worked with single-minded purpose. You manipulated her devotion. You made sure she took the risks, while you remained the grieving, respectable master." The rain had stopped outside, the silence deepening. Harriet's eyes narrowed. "So it wasn't loyalty alone that kept her from speaking your name just now. It was fear." Reginald's gaze dropped, the weight of years settling on his shoulders. "Fear and gratitude. I gave her a place when no one else would. And in return," Whimsy said, his voice now cold, "she gave you clean hands while she did the killing." The old man's breath came unevenly. "You can't prove." "Oh, but I can. That ultraviolet powder I used. It was on the ledger too. And before Mrs. Winthrop ever touched it today, someone else had left their fingerprints on those glowing pages. Yours." From the shadows near the far wall, Parker stepped forward, holding a small evidence envelope. "Found these gloves in your dressing room, sir. Looks like they've been dusted with the same powder." For a moment, Reginald's dignity held his chin high. Then it faltered. "Do you think it easy," he said hoarsely, "to watch one's family line diluted, our history dragged through the gutter? I did what had to be done. And in doing so," Whimsy replied quietly, "you've made certain the name will be remembered not for its honor, but for its murders." Reginald's shoulders slumped, the fight gone from him. He didn't resist when Parker moved in, reading him his rights in a low, measured tone. As the door closed again behind them, Harriet let out a slow breath. "2 of them," she said softly. "Working in step, all these years." Whimsy picked up his glass again, though he didn't drink. "It's always the last piece you least expect that locks the puzzle. And it's usually the one trying hardest to look harmless." The fire popped in the grate. Outside, the clouds began to thin, and the first pale glimmer of moonlight touched the wet stones of the courtyard. Inside, the house seemed emptier still, yet at last, it was honest. The echo of the constable's boots on the flagstones faded into the night, leaving only the whisper of the fire and the faint ticking of the long-case clock in the hall. Wimsey stood with one hand on the mantel, his eyes half closed as if listening to some private refrain only he could hear. Harriet watched him, knowing the moment was not one of relief but of careful reckoning. "You're still turning it over?" she said. He murmured. "Because the question is not whether justice has been served, but whether justice can ever be tidy." He left the hearth and moved toward the writing desk in the corner, pulling open the drawer where the ledger lay sealed in an evidence bag. He held it up in the firelight, its worn leather cover almost innocent in appearance. "This," he said, "was always the key. Not the names or the dates, but the manner of the entries. Look closely, and you'll see that Mrs. Winthrop's hand was firm, measured, she recorded facts. Sir Reginald's additions, on the other hand, were suggestive notes designed to guide her mind toward certain necessary conclusions." Harriet leaned closer. "So he planted the seeds, and she did the rest." "Quite. And while the police will no doubt hang her for a long string of murders, they will also have him for conspiracy, provided, of course, that he remains in custody long enough." Something in his tone made her glance sharply at him. "You think he might escape?" Wimsey smiled faintly. "I think a man like Sir Reginald has spent a lifetime weaving invisible threads. It would be naive to assume they've all been cut." As if summoned by the thought, the front door slammed open below, and the hurried, muffled voices of constables rose up the staircase. Parker appeared in the doorway, his hat askew and his face grim. "He's gone," Parker said flatly. "Coach overturned on the road to the Gall. Driver found unconscious. No sign of Reginald." For a moment no one spoke. The fire hissed softly. Then Wimsey set the ledger down with delicate precision. "Well," he said, "that answers that. Justice, it seems, has slipped through the cracks tonight." Harriet folded her arms, a chill passing over her despite the warmth of the room. "Then all of this was for nothing." "Not quite." Wimsey's eyes gleamed. "We've shown the truth for what it is. And truth, Harriet, is the sort of thing that clings. Reginald will find fewer doors open to him now, fewer allies willing to risk themselves for his comfort. And," he tapped the ledger, "we still hold his confession, if not in words, then in the fingerprints of his guilt." Parker grimaced. "And what do you propose we do? Sit here and hope he strolls back for his dressing gown?" Wimsey's gaze drifted to the darkened window. "No. We'll let him believe the storm has passed. And when he makes his next move, when he tries to reclaim whatever pieces of his old power remain, we'll be there. A hunter doesn't flush the fox until he knows which hole it will bolt for." Harriet studied him. "You've already guessed where he'll go?" "I have an idea," he said, almost lazily. "But for now, we wait. Let the official channels scramble. He will grow bold again, and when he does, the trap will be tighter than before." Parker shook his head, muttering something about damned aristocrats and their games, before stomping off to confer with the remaining constables. The house settled into an uneasy quiet. Harriet moved to the window, watching the wet moonlight glisten on the gravel drive. "So the ledger stays here?" "In the safe," Wimsey replied, "along with the other small curiosities, half-forgotten details that no one else noticed. The smudge of violet ink on Reginald's cuff the night we first spoke. The faint smell of cigar smoke in rooms he claimed never to have entered. The way he always spoke of Mrs. Winthrop's motives in the past tense, even before she had confessed them." Harriet turned to him. "And you kept all that to yourself?" He smiled faintly. A detective's stock in trade, my dear, is not just in seeing what is there, but in knowing when to reveal it. Show your hand too soon, and you invite the fox to a different hole entirely. Somewhere far off, a carriage rattled down the road, too distant to say whether it carried an escaping man or only a traveler returning home. Harriet's eyes followed the sound until it was swallowed by the night. "Do you think," she asked quietly, "that justice will ever catch up to him?" Wimsey regarded the fire for a long moment before answering. "Justice," he said finally, "is less about the swiftness of the blow than the certainty of its landing. Reginald may believe he's escaped it tonight, but the pattern of his life is set, and patterns once fixed are so very easy to follow." The fire burned low, shadows deepening in the corners of the room. The case, for now, was closed, but not ended. And in the silence between the tick of the clock and the sigh of the wind, there lingered the faint, inevitable sense that somewhere out there, the game had only just begun. The night settled heavily over the manor, the last of the constables taking their leave in tired silence. The smell of wet earth drifted in through a cracked window, mingling with the faint tang of extinguished lamp oil. Wimsey fastened the safe, spinning the dial with deliberate care, and slipped the key into his pocket as though locking away more than just paper and ink. Harriet stood by the hearth, her gaze fixed on the ledger's absence, as if the empty space carried its own weight. "You're thinking about him," she said. "I'm thinking," Wimsey replied, "about how a man like Reginald leaves no action uncalculated. Every move is the shadow of the next." They stepped into the hall together, the echo of their footsteps joining the slow, persistent ticking of the long case clock. Parker was already outside, speaking sharply to a waiting driver, his breath fogging in the cold air. Wimsey paused at the threshold, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the ground. "What is it?" Harriet asked. He crouched, running a gloved finger along the edge of the gravel path where a small, deep impression broke the otherwise uniform stones. Not a horse's hoof, nor a wheel. Something round, metal, and deliberate. He didn't speak of it, only rose, brushing the grit from his hand, and continued to the car. The ride back to town was quiet, the kind of silence that is not born of wariness but of calculation. Lamps blurred past the windows, and somewhere in the distance a train whistle called out, long and low, like a question with no answer. When they reached the flat, Wimsey moved straight to his desk. He removed his coat and set to work without explanation, drawing from a locked drawer a narrow envelope sealed with red wax. Harriet, curious, came closer. The wax bore no crest she recognized, just a small, perfectly symmetrical circle. "I take it you weren't expecting correspondence," she said. "On the contrary," Wimsey replied, carefully slicing it open. "I was expecting this 3 days ago." Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting slanted and angular. No greeting, no signature. Only a single sentence: "The ledger was never meant for you." Harriet's breath caught. "Who?" "Not Reginald," Wimsey said, his tone flat. "He'd be incapable of resisting a flourish. This is someone else." The fire hissed softly in the grate. Outside, a carriage passed, its wheels rattling over cobblestone. "And what does it mean?" Harriet asked. "That we've been playing on a board larger than we realized," he said. "Reginald's crimes were significant, yes, but perhaps they were not the centerpiece. Merely one move in a longer game." He folded the letter and slid it back into its envelope, locking it away with the same care he had shown the ledger. Then he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes half closed. "Somewhere," he murmured, "someone is watching to see what we do next." Harriet felt a chill, though the fire still burned. "And will you go looking for them?" He smiled faintly. "Oh, they'll come to us." "They always do." From the mantel, the clock chimed the hour, each note a reminder that time moved whether the case was ready to be closed or not. Outside, the rain began again, tapping lightly at the window panes. Whimsy rose and crossed to the window, looking out into the lamplit street. His gaze caught on a lone figure, standing under a lamppost across the way, half shrouded in shadow. They stood perfectly still, their face hidden, watching the flat. When Whimsy's eyes met theirs, the figure tipped their hat, just once, before turning and disappearing into the mist. Harriet joined him at the glass, but by the time she looked, the street was empty. "You saw them, didn't you?" she said quietly. "Oh yes," Whimsy replied, still watching the place where the shadow had vanished. "And they wanted me to." He stepped back from the window, his face unreadable. "Come, Harriet. Get some rest. Tomorrow we begin again." As they moved away, the fire burned lower, casting long, restless shadows across the room. In the safe, the ledger and the envelope sat side by side, two pieces of a puzzle whose edges were only just beginning to show. The case of Sir Reginald Winthrop was over. But somewhere in the damp, fog-shrouded streets of London, the next move had already been made.